Hi everybody, I'm here with Dolores Cahill, chairperson of Irish Freedom Party and candidate at the moment for Tipperary.
Yeah, for the general election.
Yeah, in the general election, so February 8th. A professor in UCD and a world-renowned, don't blush too much, researcher in biomedicine. Has to be said. So we're just going to talk about a variety of things today, but I want to start on what crosses my mind when I see your record, right? Because I think you've achieved a lot. And my curiosity is, what brought you into politics? Have you always been political, or was there a time when you kind of became more political?
I suppose I was a teenager in the 80s and 90s, and my family would have always been interested in discussing politics and the various EU referenda. And we might get into it a little bit later, but the technology I was involved in developing was basically able to provide a lot of insight into scientific research, and from that area I became aware of issues around research integrity, which I was then trying to sort out with the scientific community for 25 years. And it was more the learning process of the implications when things are not done well for society. So we might get into it a little bit later, but about 5 or 6 years ago I then decided that probably society is not so well served if scientists don't engage in the discussions around policy. So, and I have been lucky enough to be on policy advisory board. I was in Germany when I was there from 1996, and then I was on the Government Advisory Science Council here for 10 years, and I work as an expert in the European Commission, and I was seconded as an expert in strategy and policy. So I suppose for about 20 years I would be like the civil servants behind the scenes, advising, not necessarily ministers, but writing reports that would be informing ministers and governments. And in the commission, you'd be writing reports that would be published or informing commissioners. So then with that insight, about 5 or 6 years ago, sometimes even if you explain something very well and the political system should do something, it would be a win-win, that often it doesn't. And then I thought, okay, I should probably make the transition, because after 20 years, if there are things, for example, in Ireland around job creation, to help people, or to change the education system so that the 50% of people who don't go to university have a track that they can actually become, either plumbers or carpenters, or have skills to be entrepreneurs or set up companies, that really hasn't been happening in Ireland for 30 years. So I'm not saying, as always, that I have all the answers, but I think if you've been on, working on the coalface as a researcher, and then I had a company for 20 years and funding the company, developing products, and then when you advise governments for 20 years, if you see that they are not doing things that actually wouldn't cost that much money and would benefit society, that I suppose 4 or 5 years ago, but more so maybe 3 years ago, because as well in Ireland there hasn't been any new parties, and I would say a lot of the parties that are there have been saying the same thing for 30 years, and I would probably say conning people, that every 3 years or 5 years they say they're going to do stuff, but actually nobody looks back and said, what did you say 10 years ago or 15 years ago? So my impression is that the country has really gone downhill in the last 20 years, and it reminds me actually of the 80s. And a lot of the conversation in the media and in the political system is as if everything is fine in Irish society, but actually if you're in the real world in Ireland and you're trying to create a job or actually interact with the system, there is a lot of where the system can often be very slow, or if it makes mistakes is totally unaccountable. But there are thousands of rules and regulations if the citizen actually makes a mistake, so it seems kind of an imbalance. And also I think the country is really in decline, and a lot of the cities, if you look at the houses and in small towns and villages, so I just decided, well, like I said in another video, I couldn't really live with myself anymore, even though it is uncomfortable, to actually put yourself forward. I thought I would regret it if I didn't, so I decided. And then having also worked as an expert in the European Union, and I've got money, successfully competed for grants and obtained money from the European Union for 20 years. I think that a lot of the issues in Ireland are because of the lack of democracy.
Yeah.
And that is because the EU says that their laws have primacy, which actually I've looked into it. I don't think they have, but and therefore as a citizen you have no redress. So we don't actually have any input into the laws that we have to live by. And if you disagree with the law, the process takes 15 years to go to the Court of Justice, and it's hugely expensive. So it's almost like we're living in a lawless society, because the courts and the guards function as if Irish law has primacy. But actually, if you interact with the state, they can pull out one of the 128,000 regulations and say EU law has primacy. So
they can fob you off and say, what
absolutely.
can I do? Yeah.
And of course, when you look into the regulations, they are actually designed to contradict each other, so that it's almost in a Kafkaesque way that if you are a company or producing a product, if you're a small company and you do everything right, they can always find another regulation or from another, stream of regulations. Whereas if you are a big company, you usually have so many lawyers that nobody will actually ask them, even the regulators, So it's almost like we're living in a society where we don't really know the law, and therefore it kind of undermines everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, like the whole, I don't know the ins and outs of direct democracy as like a philosophy, because it is a thing of its own. But obviously things like, and you can drink every time I say immigration, right? Because it is a theme. It's a theme I'm interested in, right? So I talk about it quite a bit, but, where is our referendum on mass immigration? Right?
Absolutely.
It's an largely irreversible, that you could argue that thing, but we'll get it on all sorts of stuff, blasphemy laws, which we
or
never
whether
use.
17-year-olds should vote for the president or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so democracy could be expanded a bit and used to more effect, but again, we'll get boutique issues, and of course there's the two cheeks of the same arse thing. Like, I do think they're handing back power to Fianna Fáil. I got that impression anyway, watching Leo Varadkar in the past few weeks. That it feels to me almost like there's a concerted attempt
handing
to lose.
over. Yeah, absolutely.
Or I see this, that, the other. A bit like a Punch and Judy type of thing.
Absolutely, because I think you'd nearly need a PhD to try and determine what is the difference between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
I can't.
No, neither can I. I mean, I have tried to, but I don't understand. It's
a tough one. If you go back historically, maybe you could talk about a few things, but policy-wise now, I don't really know. Now, I want to, because we'll get into a few things. So I want to kind of cover the election in a sense.
Oh yeah, and one of the reasons why I picked Irish Freedom Party was that it was the first party that came out of the meeting in our exit that was for Ireland to get out of the EU.
Ah, very good.
So that's why.
And you because on the kind of nationalist populist scene, there is a bit of a distinct. Some people there's a variety of views on the EU, right? Most people are kind of against it, but people have different nuanced takes.
I want to leave.
You want to full on leave?
Absolutely leave, yeah. Because it's not, if you read the treaties, which I have done for a lot of the treaties, the way it was set up from the very beginning, from the original Treaty of Rome, was ever closer union. So it's not reformable.
Right, okay.
So anyone who says it's reform, it's just a con. It is not reformable.
Yeah.
They want ever closer union. So it's either in or out. And of course today is Brexit Day, which I'm very happy about. And I'd like to, Anthony Coughlin, who has been, trying to inform people about the issues around the EU, he announced that he's retiring, as he's been around for about 50 years, and he's retiring as the director of the EU Information Centre today on Brexit Day.
I don't know if you've had much time to think about it today, but what do you make of Brexit Day today, the effect on the country, our country?
I think it's positive.
Yeah.
I mean, well, for Ireland, you see, it hasn't been handled very well.
Yeah.
But I think it will be a beacon. I think the UK, it might take 4 or 5, 10 years, but it will be like a Singapore or a Hong Kong.
Okay.
I think they will do very well.
Oh, so they'll be like a little kind of node on the side of Europe, and they'll be able to take advantage of that.
Exactly. And I think that the, Kafkaesque EU regulations are a burden to European countries, including Ireland, and small businesses. And costly as well, so that there might be an option for Irish people to set up companies in the UK.
Yeah, because
And
of our
to-
special relationship.
Because of our or in Northern Ireland, if there was an issue, and I would say, because I had considered opening up another company back in 5 or 6 years ago, but I had worked out in my area I would probably have to hire about 3 people to comply with the regulations before I would make any products. And I just couldn't afford to do that. You know?
It's very silly. I mean, you come across these regulations, whether it is national or EU, when you're doing various things, work or this or that, you know, sometimes you see things that you had no idea about. And I think subsidiarity is quite a thing. Brian Flanagan in Donegal, actually, I interviewed him a year or 2 ago, a while ago, I've forgotten when, but he mentioned that to me. It was the first time I really thought about it. I think Irish Freedom Party is basically, I mean, the first subsidiarity is to just be Ireland and go from there. Now, anyway, I just want to move through some of the stuff.
Sure.
To do with the election, right?
Yes.
Because I do feel like I could end up getting distracted because there's a lot I'd love to ask you. So, in terms of the election and canvassing, have you canvassed or campaigned before, and how's it going?
So my foray was in the European elections for Ireland South last year.
Okay.
And because the Irish Freedom Party wasn't registered, I went as an independent.
Yeah.
So, and I only really put it in at the last minute, so I had 3 weeks. And it was more just to have a leadership role and also to encourage SIPO, who had our forms, many weeks to actually register the party. And they did actually register the party about a day before the election. So we had heard from other parties they had taken years. So it was but I actually was really thankful that I came 9th out of 23 candidates. So I was the top of the independents. So
that's
I got,
really good.
Yeah, so 10,000 votes, first preference votes, and 17,000 overall. So I got to the 13th count. So that was very good.
Yeah.
I was very honoured and delighted to do that. And now I'm running in Tipperary. So yeah, the canvass, it's amazing when we canvass initially, they, you know, because we are a new party, some people, I'd say 90% of people, when you say what we want to do is open the debate about the EU and also to prepare, right? It might take 5 or 10 years to actually prepare a strategy and a policy, which we are doing, for what happens if Ireland wants to leave, or if there is another banking crash coming in the next year or so, and there will be bail-ins, you know, under Basel III.
I don't actually.
Oh yeah, so so the regulations have changed for the banking system, that the way they did in Cyprus, where they can take money out of your account, that under Basel III, when your money is in a Euro bank now, it really belongs to the bank. It doesn't belong to you anymore. So if they want to take, if there's a banking crash, they can take 20% of your deposits or whatever. Right. Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how this next recession, everybody knows it's coming, how it will manifest, because it will be different to the last one. You know,
it will be different. It will be worse.
You think it'll be worse?
It will be catastrophic, I would say.
Why do you think that?
I suppose the debts like that Ireland owes. So Ireland is the 12th most indebted country in the world. It's the second after Greece. But if your viewers want to look up the world debt clock, if you look at our global debt, we have our debt to GDP, but then there's another one, global debt. So most countries would be 30% or maximally 60%. The Irish debt is 835%. So there's no other country in the top 30 of the most indebted countries in the world over 120%, and we're 835%. Yeah. So if you multiply that up by the 2.3 million people working, or whatever, the 4.8 million here per head of population, it's entirely unsustainable. And
yeah, I like there's a lot of rabbit holes, and I'm going to go down this one quickly. I'm not going to hold you to an answer here because it's a whole thing of its own. But our debt burden that we have right now, how are we supposed to deal with that going forward? Do you think it would just be something that has to be, say we got you into, if you took over the country tomorrow,
that's it,
so to speak, but write it off?
I suppose I would be going to the mint and printing either, make a phone call to Boris Johnson and say, can we use your sterling in an emergency, or have our own money, and then protect Irish mortgages, we'll say, in pillar banks, and then do a transition over a weekend to either sterling.
So you would peg the Irish pound to the sterling?
Well, or move to sterling or to the 1-to-1 or whatever, and then have an arrangement, because the whole thing is entirely unfair. The debt is really done from the financial industry, which, and that was, I suppose, the con of the 2008, 2009 and 10 banking crisis, which is always interesting that no one talks about it, that globally that was seen as totally unfair on the Irish people. So that, our pensions for our society, and we're burdened with the debts. Our debt to GDP ratio was 60% before that, one of the lowest, around 2006, and then it shot up to 120%. And around 90% it becomes unsustainable. Unsustainable, so that you can't pay the interest. So the issue with Ireland is that we cannot pay the interest on the mortgage, so we are bankrupt. So if I was lucky enough to be elected, I would start looking and say, what is Ireland spending money on? And say, well, maybe we mightn't need the 2% for PESCO. Okay. The military that the EU wants to bring us in, because we are traditionally neutral, so we do not want to be spending on it. I think there's 5,000 million that's going into the NGOs. So that could be cut. And also, I was looking it up last week in preparing for these interviews. I don't think there's any African country more indebted than us.
Wow.
So we are giving, now probably Zimbabwe, I could be wrong, but most of the countries that are, we are, would say, 12th most indebted in the world, very few of them are countries that we are giving aid to. So all of the people that are coming, immigrants from Africa and Asia, their countries are wealthier. We are actually more indebted.
I actually have $1 trillion Zimbabwean note.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. I got it just at the border. I think that was at the worst of it. They were just using US dollars at that point. They were using US dollars for real exchange, but they were selling the $1 trillion notes to tourists for a few dollars.
For a few dollars.
So they
That's
actually
very entrepreneurial.
Ironically, they became valuable in their own kind of weird way, or some of them anyway.
Because in Venezuela, actually, I was looking. It was maybe a year ago. It cost 2 million Venezuelan currency for a cup of coffee.
Wow.
2 million. So of course that is the issue that will happen if we go down the euro, because the euro has actually inflated itself 4 times in the last 20 years. So the value of a euro now is 25 cents what the value of a euro is in 1999. So that's actually really that's an inflationary spiral. But what that means for ordinary citizens is your money is worth much less, and there's a huge amount of insecurity then if you're trying to plan for your pension and your future.
So like you could cancel PESCO and cancel a few things, but then on the other hand you could write off the debt, right?
But you can't in the euro, obviously.
Yeah. See, that's the issue. I often like, this is kind of going off into fantasy land a bit, but I sometimes wonder, if Dolores Cahill and
please
IFP,
vote for me.
For starting the revolution.
We'll have no debt.
The revolution begins in Tip, like.
Yeah, exactly.
But like, if national populists more or less were to come to power, it all sounds a bit dramatic, but and were to start implementing various policies, nationalist, populist policies, I often feel like we would become the next Venezuela or Iran. Not because of the policies, but because of being sanctioned by the international community. So it would all have to be very gradual.
Well, I suppose you wouldn't necessarily overnight say that you were going to. Obviously, you'd want to be strategic about it, right? But of course, the thing you could say is, as a country, right, under our original constitution, the Irish people own the assets of the state. So you could look at our, rural communities, our land, our fisheries, whatever real reserves that we have, and you could have a currency that's backed by actually the assets of the state. Yeah, and then you could just one of the issues around the European Union is people have no clarity on the rule of law. And if you don't have clarity on the rule of law and you're a civil servant or you work, in a particular state agency, you are not accountable. Okay? So the lack of accountability then leads to corruption and waste. So for example, I think in 2011, 2012, in the HSE, they doubled the number of managers, right, at the time when all of the nurses were leaving. So that's actually a form of corruption, right, that it's actually wasteful. We probably didn't need to double the number of managers, but if the managers get together and decide to double their numbers, that means that you then become the head manager and you have 3 or 4 managers underneath you, so you get a promotion, higher salary, higher pension.
Of course.
But that is actually a total waste. So in health, we're spending 17 billion a year as an example. And then I would be saying, well, the outcomes for people, so 1 in 10 people in Ireland is in hospital, die because of an adverse event and medical error because of the health service. So 15% of people in Irish hospitals are there because of being in hospital and having an adverse event.
Okay.
But 1 in 10 people die in Ireland due to, and most of it is preventable. So a lot of the time you could just keep people out of hospital by explaining to them, if you eat good food and you reduce your stress by people. I think a lot of Irish stress and mental health is because they're being told stuff that's not true by the political system. You know?
Cortisol. Politically induced cortisol.
Yeah, that everything is fine, but
That's
no one is solving problems. It's
otherwise
like,
known as Twitter,
yeah. But you know what I mean? That there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and people look around at society and think it's not really, working for me, but nobody's actually talking about real issues and stuff like that. So I think you could actually, divert a lot of money away from waste and ill health and corruption by holding people to account. If you are the CEO of a hospital, you walk around the hospital, you're responsible for the budget. And you have to make sure that each patient in there, someone is responsible for them every 24 hours. A bit of accountability.
I often, again, I'm going into fantasy land, so this is me talking, not Dolores.
That's
right?
Fine.
But, something like the HSE, if I'm at my GP or a GP at any point, I always bend their ear for like an hour, right?
Yeah.
Wasting their time, but asking them like, so what's because no better person to ask.
Absolutely.
And they often say, this is in Cork, I just remember one of them particularly saying, I was like, what would fix the hospitals? Because obviously we have a problem. You're going to wait 2 years for an appointment and all of this. He said, if you went up to the CUH, Cork University Hospital, and just got rid of the entire administrative, bureaucratic
patient
system
doctor.
He said if you got rid of that, he said it would work just as well. And then he corrected himself. He was like, no, better. And he didn't mean that politically or anything. He was just saying that's the way it would work.
And an example of that, I remember when I was pregnant, I turned up at 7:30 for an 8 o'clock appointment, and there was another 20 women there, and we all had 8 o'clock appointments.
Oh my God.
And I went in at 11:30, but of course if you're working, that's not
Yeah.
But then when you go in the private, you get an appointment for a particular time, and if the doctor's running late, even this was like 15 years ago, you got a text to say don't come.
Yeah,
so that's very simple.
I mean, and you're from speaking to you, I think you're a systematic thinker and a kind of a strategic thinker, right? And I'm probably off in the clouds again, which I've said multiple times. But sometimes to think of your general vision and then put it into an actually coherent strategy is a good way of doing it. And my general vision is like, if you were to find somebody in a hospital who's a doctor, a good doctor who has a good sense of the what's wrong and whatever, and you were to say you have basically carte blanche, you can walk around this hospital for the next month and you have what you say goes, right? As long as it's not insane, and just say you do it. And you get the power of some people to veto you if you're going crazy. No vested interest. It shouldn't be that hard to organise.
Well, and I suppose as well we should say, of course, there's a lot of good nurses and doctors working in a system.
They're amazing. Yeah.
But I suppose in a way that does happen. Whether for good or ill, we do have private hospitals, and they see about 3 or 4 patients per consulting hour than the public.
Yeah, I had to get something done at one point, and I was on a list for a long time, so I said I'm just going to go private, and so I went in there. And I was surprised by how it wasn't actually very expensive. And I was kind of looking at it going, that's really cheap. This seems like it was done at a loss almost. And it was really, really, really good. And it was, I won't say luxurious, but really pleasant.
Efficient,
quick, easy. You ring everything works really well. So again, just replicating that, it would cost the state like half the amount it does at that level of efficiency.
But actually, I've been looking at it. There's a bureaucratization of a lot of areas, even in education. As well as healthcare. And that is kind of a system that removes accountability and responsibility. So that has been creeping into a lot of professions, and a lot of that is associated with bodies. That oversight and kind of implementing regulations. But it just means that things are not run as efficiently, and there's less direct accountability for people. So you could make people directly accountable, I mean, which would be one of our issues.
That seems to be a big
Yeah.
theme you're going at, is direct
Yeah.
accountability, and I want to get a look at that more
And
broadly.
maybe
in a sec.
merit-based promotion, right? So
That
if
would-
you're good,
yeah.
that you'd be rewarded. Yeah.
Yeah, and there again, because you're a strategic, systematic thinker, I'm sure there would be a way to do that,
Yeah.
Effectively. Now, you mentioned schools.
Yes.
Schools are like struggling at the moment, from what I can see. For teachers, seem to be saying a lot of this. And I saw a lady on Prime Time, so everybody can get ready to drink again, because I'm going to
Okay.
mention immigration. A lady on Prime Time, or on with Miriam O'Callaghan, and she was talking about schools and how basically the facilities are more or less fine. There's just too many people per teacher.
Mhm.
And then she mentioned that 40% of her students are from abroad, and they have to be taught English.
English, yeah, that's right.
I mean, what gets me is that, and I'm going to arrive at a question, what gets me about that is how, even when she was saying that, she had to prepare it very delicately. And then she had to say, no, we love,
You
and
have to preface it, yeah.
I've seen this with the asylum thing as well. They'll almost, in order to say what they want to say, they have to say the opposite, to say, actually I want more,
Yeah.
but also it's too much, and
Mm.
they can half say it. I mean, you're big into free speech and all of that
I
as well.
am big into free speech,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that society only works if people can speak freely, and I think that's one of the lines that when
Mm.
they start. So I mean, there are policies and issues around cultural Marxism now in the universities that I have been finding difficult and have been trying to raise. In the university system now, if someone says, like if I said I could tick in HR that I'm a man,
Yeah.
that I could then go to an interview and then be, if they wanted to have quotas for 40% men,
Mm.
that I could, be interviewed as a man, and then a week later you could just tick the box as a female or whatever.
Mm.
And I think there is a biological underpinning to male and female, and I think that's wrong.
How terrible of you to say. How ghastly.
And I have been
Yeah.
saying that as well, but it's interesting, there's a lot of silence when you say it, that there
Mm.
is an actual biological. And of course, if you delve into the whole Marxist, cultural Marxist deconstruction agenda that's going on for 20 years, that, that what they want to do is to remove facts and reality away from any discussion. And what's interesting is that if you do that in one area, it kind of harms your soul, so you're broken as a person. So while the tiptoe to totalitarianism says, oh well, just we'll just prevent you from using this one word and then the next word, that actually if you start saying even one or two things that are not true,
Yeah.
it breaks your soul.
I think Theodore Dalrymple said you lose your sense of probity, and
Okay.
like it is like that. I mean, if you're confronted with a man, and you see this around online anyway, and it does happen in reality. If you're in some institution and you're visited by some man or something, it's Trans Awareness Day, and it's a guy who's clearly a man, and I'm just repeating what you said really, but that does break you.
It does.
I mean,
now of course, I'm genetics is my background. There are intersex people, and it's quite rare. But I think what's very sinister about the political correctness and cultural Marxists is they obviously have put a lot of thought into it, that they find the very rare cases, and then they take something and then they extrapolate it. So I think as well, Irish people, we have been really railroaded by it, because we are actually nice people, and we generally had a sense of humour, and we're charming. So I think we have been intimidated more. And I also think because Irish people, we've lots of cousins and big families and large communities, that once you start doing this cultural Marxist thing, that if you trip over a wire, as Douglas Adams said, you will disgrace yourself and your family, that because we are kind of well known within our communities, Irish people are much more sensitive to that. So I think I have very little respect for what is going on. And also the Minister for Education is advertising jobs for 20 only female professors. And of course that is discrimination against men. Yeah. And that's illegal.
It is, and it's like,
and you have to call it out, which I have been doing.
And I'm glad you are, but it's this is kind of stating the obvious, but again, there's no quota for veterinarians. I think it's a largely female dominated area.
or midwives,
yeah,
or bricklayers, or
primary school
ESB
teachers.
engineers that go
Yeah.
out at 2:00 in the morning.
The bin men. I say bin men because
Exactly.
I should say bin person. But why would I say bin person when I've never
Yeah.
seen a woman
Yeah.
collecting the rubbish?
Exactly.
So we need 50-50 on that.
Yeah,
right?
and I think
we
it's
can start
crazy.
with the Irish Times journalists and all of these,
Yeah,
ladies who are all about gender equality. Maybe they could
Yeah.
do some of the bins and do everything.
Yeah. So I think what we have to do is push back and draw the line and say, because of course, if they don't see where they're going, then if you're saying, okay, you can have 20 only female professors, then the next one is, okay, you can have 20 only male professors.
Yeah. And I find, you mentioned it starts with the legitimate thing, like intersex is a real thing.
It's a real thing.
And then you go from there and you expand it. And it's the same with the immigration stuff, right? So you go, you wouldn't hate somebody who's in the room with you who's of a different ethnic or cultural background or whatever. You go, of course not. And that kind of just somehow translates into mass immigration.
Exactly.
And I think people are caught by that. I think it's important for people out there, activists and journalists and people like that. It's what I try to do anyway, is try to kind of untangle some of these things.
Absolutely. No, and you do it very well. About a year or two ago, I had to go to Brazil to give a talk. And I had to, 2 months before, send them a proof of ownership of my house, a bank statement, my passport, and a letter from my work. And the professor that I was going to see had to give his passport and proof that he was. And I was only going for a week. And I had to present all that to go for a week.
Yeah.
And I was given a visa for a week to Sao Paulo, to Brazil.
Yeah. I mean, you didn't feel discriminated against?
Not at all.
Yeah.
But I mean, so I think, we have to cherish our country, and I think we have a duty and a responsibility. We inherited our country from the generations before us. And I mean, it's outrageous that we have to say that we had, had people who invaded us for 800 years that actually spoke a very subtle different language and had a very subtly different religion. But yet the Irish people, and of course they did, prevent us from speaking our own language, and there was the penal laws where we were literally, oppressed and curtailed, and they removed us from our land. And what we see now, I think, in the last 15 years, it's like Ireland is not the country that I knew, and that Irish people are cowed down to say, wait a minute, I think we need to reverse this emigration. And I think, someone who's a migrant or an asylum seeker or whatever, that, for example, in Syria, the mothers, after the war is over now, want people to return home. And what's more insidious is that when you look behind it, it's really the big business agenda to move people around the world, to have power, because the people who are coming from, say, Africa and Asia, are their middle and upper class. And they are the elites in those countries. And if you have a system that removes the elites, it will be easier for those countries to be corrupted.
Yeah.
So that, and also we have a pro-family agenda, and really, if they should be with their families, and 500,000 Irish people that are all over the world should be with our families. So I would say that we need to assert the right of Irish people to live in Ireland, and if 1 million people have come to Ireland, that we need to say, and I would be happy to pay tax to facilitate them to return home and to provide funding for them in their home country, and to close the borders. I would say, can we just take 5 years to sort ourselves out, because it's one of the biggest changes in population, I would say, ever. I think we need to be brave enough to do it. But of course, the reason we can't do it is because we are members of the European Union.
Yeah.
And the EU has this ridiculous thing that, you can't trade within the EU without having open borders. And that is not true, of course. We trade all over the world. So unfortunately, the EU is actually quite sinister when you look into the history of the EU in the 30s, 40s and 50s. It actually is really a way to deconstruct individual countries to just have a federal state, which is very sad.
I'm interested in knowing more about that, the origins of the EU. Where do you get that?
Sorry.
No, take your time.
So I've forgotten. There's a book in 1934. Now, I can picture the book, but anyway, I haven't got the name. But
you can tell me afterwards, and I'll put it in the description.
Written in 1934, and it was 7 steps to go from national countries to a federal state. And each of the 7 steps were the titles that were used for the different phases of the European Union. So what I think is shocking about that is that I'm old enough to remember the very early debates, around, maybe not the original vote for going into the EU, but all through the 80s there was a lot of discussions. And everyone was telling us, this is just an economic unit and grouping. But of course, if you read this book and the history, which was used by the European Union and to be a federal state, is all along they had the last one, and we're in stage 6, and the next one is federal state. So what I think when people are criticising us, or even in the Brexit debate about lying, that really people have been lied to from the very beginning.
And there's a kind of a feeling some people will react to that and say, oh, well, that sounds, and I think some people would go, oh, well, I don't know about that, or whatever. That might sound like a bit overly conspiratorial. Now, if just for people who are very kind of, what's the word, anti-skeptical, right? The like completely, that's it, I'm going to coin that one, anti-skeptics.
That's a good one.
Yeah, people who are like resistant against the very idea of skepticism. And we're seeing more of that now. It's weird. It's like kind of cult-based, I think, these days. Believe absolutely everything.
Yeah.
It's one thing to have a tinfoil hat on, but there's a kind of an extremity to the opposite side.
Well, they're afraid not to believe things, you see.
Yeah, it's strange that.
They're sheep.
And like, they would say, oh, well, that, I don't know if I'd believe all that. And it's like, well, it's a further jump to assume that there was no plan. It was just like, let's just have a coal agreement and we don't know what we'll do after that. Of course, there's planning goes on for 100 years.
Now there's a Foreign Office document from the United Kingdom, FCO 148, if anyone wants to, and it was the briefing document for the year or so to the government ministers, and was released under Freedom of Information. And that goes into great detail in the United Kingdom to say that it would be a complete loss of sovereignty, and explains the direction of where this European Union project is going. But that the ministers were instructed to keep it secret and not to mention sovereignty at all. So this is a public document, it's authenticated, and it was, so that the Heath and the ministers in the UK, they knew. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was shared with Ireland, because we have very close ties then.
Of course, yeah. That's likely.
So it's quite sinister,
Yeah.
People have been lied to for decades. So I think that's another reason why we need to, have the other side of the argument about the European Union. It's not, it's actually quite sinister, I think, and it's undermining, because people love their homeland and they love their family, and they want democracy and they want rule of law, and they want to elect people that make their laws. And I was born into a country where that was the case. And I think what we need to do is to wake people up and look around and see what's happening in Ireland, and especially how small towns and villages in rural Ireland are deteriorating, and in Dublin.
Yeah. I want to ask you about rural communities, but just a quick, because you've just gotten my mind going, a quick PSA for, let's say, the few millennials who will be watching this. I'm a millennial, who is
That's
not
totally last century.
They're watching it. They might not be kind of nationalist, populist, all of that. And what I would say is, like, you mentioned a debate. Just opening up the discussion. That's a very humble proposition, and even if so the reason I say it to millennials is because I remember the pro-EU propaganda in our CSP and geography textbooks and all of that, right? And the same goes for diversity and equality. Absolutely, and all of this stuff, right? I would just say, do you not question why in school and in all of these things there wasn't here's why the EU is fantastic and great, here's why it's not a good thing, or that would be an education, right?
Absolutely.
It's both things, but we didn't get that. Therefore, the onus is on us all to maybe give extra room to the skeptical argument, because we've had it so much the other way. Now,
just to say, there are like a number of bodies in the European Union, and there's the European Council, the Council of Europe, and the Council of the European Union, and they're all different.
Right.
So they don't make it easy for you to distinguish. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm fairly ignorant on it.
And there's 7 like institutions, the Commission and the Court of Justice, but nobody ever explains. You know what I mean? It's all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
And you have to actually, so people criticize me and say, oh, well, you've worked in the European Commission or you've got money, therefore, as if you can't be critical then, you know, you've...
That's exactly the person I would want to be on my side.
But of course, there's a lot of resistance to somebody who has worked there, but it's like you can really only have worked there to realise how it works, and everyone is extremely busy, but does anybody read what they do? So I used to make a joke when I worked there, which was very true, that if you wanted to never find something again, put it up on the Commission website, publish it,
and of course the democratic deficit and all of that, we've heard those arguments through Brexit, but that is the case. I mean, people can look that up. Now, rural communities in Ireland, what's your feeling on that?
I think it's very sad. I mean, it's just it is sad, and people are being demoralised, and I think there's, as part of Agenda 21, there's been changes in the planning structures in all countries in the world, but including Ireland. So they're making it now difficult. They're saying that you can't, if you build houses, one-off houses anymore. And I think they're also encouraging farmers to put their farms into companies. And I would say that might be part of Agenda 21, because then it's easier to change the laws around companies in 20 years' time. And they're also have planning to have these data centres on fertile land. And then with the single farm payment as well, it's not that much money, but if you agree to that, then the EU regulators can just come onto your land. Whereas when I grew up, you had your house and you had your farm, and unless you broke a law can someone come in. But of course, once you sign up to the single farm payment, and then they can, so what's been happening with the farming community is that if somebody raises an issue around glyphosate or an issue to do with anything, they get an inspection, and then someone just comes and they have a piece of paper that says you have broken EU regulations from the department. But I went to just defend a farmer. They didn't name what the regulation was, so I asked them which regulation, on a voluntary basis, and they didn't know. So they had cut his single farm payment, but without it. And then I asked them, do you know how many regulations there are? There are 45,000
It's a nightmare.
EU regulations, 45,000. But even on the department website, there are classes of regulations, but it's not in writing. When you go and look at the regulations, it's just a voice recording of an overview of the regulations, but you don't have it as a farmer in writing, so you can't print it out and check.
And the level of these regulations, if you're a large farmer, like a corporate mega farmer, like a prairie type of thing, which I do think they're kind of trying to introduce, then you can afford a massive legal team and all of the, or not even legal team, but just you can pay for that to be kind of worked out for you. And the smaller farmer doesn't have that.
But I suppose the thing is 45,000 regulations. There is no way that anyone can ever read them. And before, when I was checking it out up until, actually I checked them out, I checked the regulations regularly, but you could only search and you only got 9,999. You couldn't actually find the other.
Okay.
So that has changed now. I actually looked it up last week, but maybe because I've been saying it, that you couldn't actually find the regulations. And then as well, it's chaired by someone as an independent chair under the statute. But actually what I was thinking is that anyone could chair it, so they're not, we wanted to record that, we weren't allowed, and the chair said, that we couldn't be sarcastic.
Oh dear.
And that if, so it was a bizarre kind of, and then when she did the review, it was a totally unjust. This farmer had actually published a video informing people about something, and he had previously had an inspection where everything was perfect all his life, and then they found something that was wrong and didn't have any evidence for it, but they still cut his payment.
Yeah, that's not good.
No, that's not good. So
I want to ask you kind of I don't know, is it a fun question, but it's something I'm very curious about, and I'll kind of build the bridge between what we have been talking about. So farming, to me, with the beef protests and everything, it seems like there's an effort to drive the small farmer out of business, basically, and again have these larger farms and efficiency and all of that stuff. But then, this kind of globalist system means that you will rely on certain types of food to come in from abroad, and it's kind of messianic and big picture, kind of looking at it from 30,000 feet, but it's not very sustainable, and maybe it's not very resilient to shocks, I find, or I feel like if globalism is challenged by outside factors,
Absolutely, yeah.
then we're kind of effed, I'll say, right? We're just a little bit screwed, because we aren't
and that
sustainable.
might be the plan. I think that might be the bigger plan, unfortunately. So, for example, I think in 2018, 90% of Irish potatoes were imported and 90% of our onions.
That so
It's
again,
ridiculous.
it seems crazy, but maybe when everything is running okay, then they can somehow justify it, right? But so that's the bridge to my next question, which is you have worked your entire life basically in biomedicine, and we currently have the coronavirus, right?
Yes, which I don't know much about. But
No, I
yeah.
won't hold you to that, but just in terms of like, and you may or may not have an answer on this. I can leave it, but people talk about the big pandemic, and or sometimes people look at a thing like coronavirus and say it's all hyped up. Do you think there is resiliency to the large global pandemic that most people in popular culture feel like is always waiting to
So it's very
happen?
hard to know. So
Yeah.
I mean, I would know a little bit about the Ebola virus just because I worked at the Commission during the outbreak, and that did kill 1 in 3 people that got the Ebola virus died within a month. So that is a real, if that came... Now, it turns out that there were some Europeans that were working there that did fly to Europe and could have infected European people, but they didn't. So, as in all immune-related things, if you are well-nourished and you are healthy, you have a better resilience. So a lot of time vitamin A and vitamin D are very important and good food and lack of stress. So that what's doubly unfair, I suppose, especially in Africa, that if people are malnourished, that when they get a virus, and in Asia as well, they might have a higher death rate than people, if they were well nourished in Africa, they would be fine, or in Europe. So so Ebola is definitely real, and it is, has potential to be a pandemic.
Yeah, it wouldn't even have to be a pandemic. It's just my kind of pet theory is that globalism is a very delicate, insofar as it does work, because sometimes you have to give the devil its due to an extent. Insofar as it does work, it's very dicey, because...
but I think morally as well, like really what would be great, what I would love to see is, like the farmers have top class beef, and that they are been undercut by beef that comes from South Africa or South America that's now getting almost the same price. So I think what would be great would be if we could encourage Irish people, in regions to grow for certain families that would opt in, maybe 200 families and say, now they do this in Norway, where I think it's 68 families is what they've worked out, it works, that they would agree to buy their vegetables from 10 farmers, and then the farmers would decide they would grow different vegetables or different crops throughout the year. So that you would also have local food grown in season, and then there could be a low air miles or whatever, a local market, and you would provide jobs in rural Ireland. But the most important thing is the food would be healthy, and it wouldn't be in plastic, and there wouldn't be a lot of chemicals on it.
Fresh and seasonal.
And you would build communities, because when you think back, all of Ireland was thriving up to, with people working in rural Ireland, providing each other with different services. So I do have a lot of hope now. I think that we are at the peak, of the running down of Ireland, and it might take, in general, 5 or 10 years. And I think what we want to do is, whether we get elected or not, is actually we are working with a lot of groups together to try and get people to help each other, whether we get elected or not.
That's good. Yeah. It's kind of a preparedness thing as well, because whether it's this time or next time, that's very good.
But also I was thinking you could have innovative aspects, like say if you were a patient in hospital and someone out there developed an app that you could rate the food or rate the service, So I think, and then that the hospitals, people could rate the hospital, right? So I think at the minute the whole state is working as if we were back in 1980. And we have this huge bureaucracy, and it doesn't serve, like we pay them to not do a good job. So I think even if you don't get elected, you could actually have a call out for innovative approaches to reduce the cost of the healthcare system to make people accountable.
That's a great way of looking at it. And again, you have that out there, and then if and when you do get elected, you're also more prepared, so it's a bit of a win-win.
But also people could decide which hospital to go to depending on the quality of the food.
Oh, very good.
That's what I mean. You know that if you're a patient and you could see what ward or what hospital, you could actually say if if there was a nap, that I don't want to go to that hospital because, people are there for whatever, twice as long as another hospital. So that, that we need to be innovative to change the system because there is a hierarchy and there are the unions and the whole thing is quite, contained. And what I'm thinking now is that certain aspects of Ireland works really well for some people. So say like me, I have a salary and I have a pension and things are working well for me. But people who are actually paying for all that, like the small business owners and the farmers, they are paying for all the civil servants, all of revenue, all of the departments, the ministers, all of this foreign aid, the government, the European
NGOs.
Union, all NGOs and the European, the Court of Justice and, all of the commissioners and the whole and they actually, when they want to get a service, they often have to be on a waiting list. And then if they make any money or whatever, revenue will come along and not actually acknowledge, say if you have outgoings or a mortgage or whatever, they don't seem to, they just say, okay, you've made an income, we want the tax.
Yeah.
But they actually take no account, whereas if you were on social welfare or whatever, you would be getting a medical card. Like if a person who works is sick, they are just sick and they have to work, they don't get anything. Yeah. So I'll just say that I think our system discriminates against working people.
It's kind of it's not means tested. I'm cutting across you, sorry, but it's not means tested, just to emphasize your point. It's for example, if you're doing ostensibly reasonably okay, but you have a disabled child or this or that,
or
it doesn't say, okay,
disease.
well, you're making this amount to start with, but you have these extenuating circumstances.
Yeah, but I think it actually discriminates because if you're working, you have no access to the law. You, if you're not working, you get free legal aid.
Yeah.
But if you're working, you have no access to the law. You have no redress.
Yeah.
And also, if you earn a little bit more, you have no access to health. So you're working, you're sick, you're paying for everybody else, but you don't get anything. And if they have to go to court, they get free legal aid. But if you're working, you don't, so therefore you have no redress. So you have all the burden of funding the system, but you have to work when you're sick.
Yeah.
And if somebody does something to you because you're engaging in work, a barrister will say 15 to 20,000 or whatever, and you can't do it.
Yeah, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can tell from listening to Herman and various IFP people, including yourself, I don't think it's about a cutthroat kind of libertarian kind of state.
Oh
of
no, we want to.
safety.
But I think that people working, so of course people who are not working should get support, of course. But it shouldn't be that people who are working get nothing.
It's just a matter of systems and efficiency. Yeah,
exactly. And people should be encouraged to work if they're able to. And I think there's actually a mental health aspect to it as well, that it's often not so healthy to not work. So even if you were to volunteer, so of course we're done if people really are unwell and they don't want to. But it's kind of a vicious circle that if you're at home and you're isolated, anyone would be. And of course there are simple things like choirs and community. So like to make people happy, and they need just healthy food, to have family or a few people that love them, and actually volunteering or engaging in community. So people really, they just want security in their home. They want to eat good food. They would love their children to be in their neighbourhood, and they want to give something back in general. And I think that's the tragedy that Irish people don't see, is that we have a whole generation that are outside of Ireland, and grandparents are only seeing their children, in Australia, and their grandchildren, when actually we should, and we would love to have a programme to bring that 500,000 people back. And especially when you go around rural Ireland, there are lots of empty houses. So we just need, and I've been talking about it a lot, like an SSIA type programme to renovate houses. So people could even live in the ground floor, until that was renovated, and then work in their local communities. And they would have more children because they would have a low mortgage, and one person could work.
Which again is healthier for the individual and healthier for society. I think I think that's a big theme of what you're saying, is just to promote a healthy society, and a healthy society is a healthy individual, and all of these various things.
And mental health as well.
Yeah.
And community.
Yeah, I'm including that, because physical and mental health, and of course those two are kind of inextricably linked as well, aren't they? It's simple things like that. Like you mentioned, if you're working, like you say, you're not against a safety net for people, but again,
absolutely, of course,
the biggest tragedy is someone who's maybe working a job they like, and they're on that margin of they don't have, because the rents and mortgages are high. If they get a toothache, they're screwed or whatever.
Absolutely.
Right? So they kind of start to say, well, I may as well be on the dole because I'd get a medical card and all of that.
Exactly.
And then you're forcing somebody off into obscurity and back into the room.
And there's very little programs. Like, I mean, I don't know if it's the case, but I know up to a year or two ago that if you worked for a day or two, they cut you off and you didn't get on the system, which was ridiculous. I mean, in other countries you would just say, which should be the case, you just say I'm working today. Yeah. And if I'm not working, because that's how you get people back to work. So I'm saying that's the kind of thing that it's almost incentivizing people to be dependent on the state. And unfortunately, when you look at a lot of the education system and a lot of the whole university system, it is going down this big state route. And big state means that they want to push people into welfare. Yeah, which just means they have more control. And it's quite sinister, and I don't think a lot of people see it. And another thing that I've become aware of is how if the man, leaves the family home, then they get twice the social welfare. Now, it might have changed now, but of course that is a way, or the woman, but then they say they're separated, they get twice the amount of money. But that is undermining family, right? So, of course, when we say we are pro-family, that we want to encourage families to be the main unit of society. And I've heard an awful lot of shocking things from Tusla.
If you want to elaborate on some of the...
Well, I suppose a lot of it would be in whistleblowing, but I mean, it's shocking that the state, it seems very difficult that parents don't get their children back, and I would definitely think that referendum needs to be looked into. And I think there should not be private courts. I think it should be that whatever the people interacting with those children and those parents, whether it's a number or whatever, but it should be tracked to see, are certain areas more children been taken away, or because of course it's a money-making scheme. If you take a child, they can then go into the foster care, and then somebody makes a whole lot of money, and the professionals make a lot of money, and they're sending children to the UK, and sometimes it's costing like 14,000 a week. It's crazy.
The last thing you want is to build in a perverse incentive and a kind of an industry into something as sensitive as that. I mean, people talk about the privatized prison system in the US and all of this, but in terms of taking children away from their parents,
so the thing is, if you were to put a fraction of that money into educating people or providing playgrounds, or that you can actually build up skills for parents. And I would say, in a few years, people will be saying, don't give mobile phones to children. Don't let them be until 6. And obviously that's what parents that are better informed do anyway. But it's very sad when if people are not told that, they then end up with children that when you take the mobile phones away are cranky, and then when they go to school, they have attention deficit disorder. So that if you could actually encourage parents themselves to put the phones away, to have healthy food for the kids, but just if you were to put more money into as well, have grandparents, and there was a lot of removal of grandparents from their children as well. Of
course, intergenerational breakdown, and it is about finding a way to, because childhood health, I suppose, our development is extremely important. We want to find a way to do that without separating families.
And I think we have probably the children, a lot of children now from about 0 to 15 are probably not so healthy. And I think, what we should be doing is saying anything that's done to a child has to really be rigorously safety tested and not just given by default.
That makes complete sense. Now, we have gone for an hour and 5, I'm looking at now, right? It went kind of quick, actually. And I think we've been all over the place with this. We've talked about a lot of topics that I'm delighted we did. But I started on the campaign, the kind of basic question, how's it going? and I didn't really get to it. How is the campaign going for you this time? Have you been canvassing at all?
I have been canvassing a bit, but of course I'm working full time. And we also, just to comply to get elected, you have to fill in the forms and go down to Tipperary and then get the posters done. So I'm going to be campaigning this weekend, but I have been campaigning and it's gone very positively. And in fact, people are contacting me, to campaign for me as well, and to hang up the posters and to do everything. So it's good. I think there are a lot of worried people out there, and the people who contact us are in shock. I think I was in shock from about 2013, 14, 15, 16. And then, it is quite worrying when you find out really what's going on. So they are stunned and shocked and emotional and upset, I think. So what they want to do, which is it's really good, is at least do something. Yeah, which I think is a really powerful thing. And so what I say to them as well is sit down and talk to, maybe every month or so, just look in your mobile phone and sit down and try and over the next year, explain to a sister or an aunt or whatever, just not overwhelmingly amounts, but just because people are not getting it in the media. There's very little discussion. And when you try and talk to people, they're actually frightened. When you say something that is one of those tripwires, you can see that people, most Irish people, they don't want to know. And I think they actually know in their hearts there's something wrong, but they're afraid to go there. So I think, but once you go there yourself, I was, upset, I was stunned, for some time. But once you realize, okay, it's bad, but it's solvable. And people, the more people that, aren't overwhelmed by it and just say, because I think what I would love to do in Tipperary or in Ireland is that you get groups of people in their own communities. And the way there was it Liam Mellon or whatever, used to go to South Africa. You remember Irish people would go to South Africa and they would renovate a house that Irish people in towns, villages, cities of rural Ireland could say, what could we do? Would we just have a choir? Like if you just bring people together, or if one family said, could we take some of our savings and buy a house and try and start the renovation to bring one cousin home or one family member home a year, and that maybe they would get married and have children or whatever. That I think globalism works if everyone is very stressed and think there's nothing we can do. And I think the battles will be won by, every family that's reunited and every house that's renovated.
That is a lovely way of putting it. And you talk about the difficulty sometimes in approaching people with these ideas, and there's a way to get around that. But I think positivity and proactivity,
absolutely,
leading by example in that vein, I think people will follow you all by themselves. It's kind of a cheesy ending, but no better example than yourself, to be honest. And I hope you get a lot of votes.
Thank you. I hope so. So if anyone's in Tipperary, I hope they will vote for me. Thank you.
So like and comment, specifically comment. I'd love if you would give your point of view, and any questions you have, I'll try to answer them. And of course subscribe as well. So
and I have one more little thing. And just to say that we are in Irish Freedom supporting all the independents and all the small parties, the National Party, Renua, and ACI, Anti-Corruption Ireland, and all the independents. I think there are 78 candidates between independents and small parties. So the main thing is go out and vote for people on our side. Yeah, so big tent. If you don't have an IFP candidate, vote for somebody else. Absolutely, exactly. Of course. Great. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye. See ya.